The grocery store hummed with the rhythm of daily life. Shoppers moved through the aisles, carts squeaking and conversations blending into a steady backdrop of activity. It was a sunny afternoon in Compton, California, a place with a rich history and vibrant community and the hometown of Snoop Dogg himself. For most, it was an ordinary day, but for Snoop and those who crossed paths with him, it would become a moment etched into memory. Near the produce section, an elderly woman named Mrs. Carter stood with an air of impatience. Likely in her late 70s, she adjusted her glasses as she reached for a bag of apples. Her neatly pinned silver hair and faded cardigan gave her an unassuming look. Yet, behind the gentle exterior lay a sharp tongue that would soon create waves. Snoop Dogg, dressed in his signature laid-back style with a blue Compton hoodie and jeans, moved through the same aisle. A basket balanced in one hand, his other hand tapped out a text on his phone. The rapper's easygoing demeanor blended seamlessly with the environment, and though a few people glanced his way, most carried on without much fuss. But not Mrs. Carter. As Snoop reached for a bag of oranges, Mrs. Carter's gaze locked onto him. Her expression shifted, her eyes narrowing, and her lips pursing tightly. The quiet murmurs of the store were interrupted by her sharp, loud voice. "You people don't belong here," she said, her tone carrying across the aisle. Snoop froze mid-motion. His fingers hovered over the oranges as he processed the unexpected remark. Shoppers nearby paused, their movements halting as if time itself had slowed. Some exchanged awkward glances, while others avoided looking altogether, pretending not to have heard. But the words hung in the air, impossible to ignore. Mrs. Carter, emboldened by the silence, pressed on. "Why don't you go back to Africa where you came from?" Her tone was firm, unapologetic. The weight of her words settled like a heavy fog. Snoop's initial reaction was one of visible shock. His brow furrowed as he straightened, his face unreadable. For a moment, it seemed he might respond immediately. But instead, he took a slow, deliberate breath, letting the tension stretch. Mrs. Carter's stance remained defiant. She clutched her apples tightly, her chin lifted as though daring him to respond. The atmosphere in the store shifted. A young mother hurried her child out of the aisle, while an older man near the potatoes, Mr. Perez, hesitated, watching intently. A teenage employee stacking bananas froze, unsure whether to intervene or stay out of it. Finally, Snoop spoke. His voice was calm but carried an edge of unmistakable conviction. "Ma'am," he began, "do you even realize what you just said?" The question wasn't aggressive. It was reflective, almost gentle, as though giving her a chance to reconsider her words. But Mrs. Carter's expression hardened further. "I said what I said," she snapped. "This is my country, people like you don't belong here." A collective gasp rippled through the nearby shoppers. One woman near the bread aisle audibly whispered, "Oh my God." Others simply stood in stunned silence. Snoop, however, remained composed. He didn't raise his voice or take a step closer. Instead, he let the silence grow, filling the space between them like an unspoken challenge. Finally, he nodded slowly. "All right," he said, his calmness unnerving. "Since you brought it up, let's talk about it." He carefully set his basket down on the floor, his movements deliberate and precise. The crowd around them seemed to hold its collective breath. Even those who had pretended not to notice were now riveted. Snoop's presence grew larger, his calm demeanor commanding attention. "You said I don't belong here," he began, his voice steady but firm. "Let me tell you about where I come from." His words carried weight, each one spoken with care. My great-great-grandfather was born right here in California. But before that, my ancestors were brought here against their will, forced to build this country without freedom, without dignity. Mrs. Carter's face flushed, but she said nothing. The crowd, however, was transfixed. A man in a baseball cap near the deli counter put down his phone entirely. An older couple whispered to each other but kept their eyes fixed on the scene. My grandfather, Snoop continued, his voice gaining strength, fought in the Korean War. He risked his life for this country, but when he came home, he couldn't sit at the same counters, couldn't drink from the same fountains. But he stayed. You know why? Because he believed in the promise of this country, even when it didn't believe in him. The silence in the store was profound, even the hum of refrigerators seemed to fade. And my parents, Snoop went on, his tone softening, fought too. Not with guns or fists, but with their lives. My mother, a teacher, spent her life educating kids about love and equality. My father, a community leader, helped people no matter who they were. They taught me to respect everyone, no matter what they look like. He paused, his gaze steady on Mrs. Carter. So, when you tell me to go back to Africa, you're ignoring the truth. My family paid the price for this country in blood, sweat, and tears. I'm as much a part of this land as you are. Maybe even more. The crowd began to shift, murmurs spreading as Snoop's words resonated. A man near the dairy section stepped forward hesitantly. He's right, he said quietly but firmly. We've got to be better than this. The words seemed to break a spell. More voices chimed in. My dad fought in that same war, said an older woman near the frozen foods. He always said the only color that mattered was the red on the flag. Even the young cashier, Ava, spoke up from her station. I've never seen someone handle something like that so gracefully. Thank you, she said. Mrs. Carter's face was pale, her hands trembling slightly. She opened her mouth as if to respond but stopped. She glanced around, realizing no allies were coming to her defense. Slowly, she gripped her cart and wheeled it toward the exit, her head bowed. Snoop watched her go, his expression softening. Turning to the crowd, he spoke again. Ignorance doesn't get better in silence, he said. It's up to all of us to do better. To stand up. To speak out. But to do it with respect. The crowd erupted into applause, hesitant at first but growing louder. Strangers nodded to each other, inspired by what they had witnessed. Snoop picked up his basket, finishing his shopping with quiet dignity. Later that evening, as the story spread through the community, it became more than just a grocery store encounter. It became a lesson, a reminder of the power of words and the strength it takes to confront hate with dignity and truth. And for Mrs. Carter, it marked the beginning of a change she hadn't seen coming. Disclaimer: all stories shared on this channel are fictional and created for entertainment purposes. We aim to inspire kindness, equality, and understanding. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals is purely coincidental.